Yeah, there are a couple. One was just asking for you to repeat the name of that faded chart, something yoga.
Oh, Kala Sarpa Yoga. Kala. Kala means time and Sarpa means serpent. Sarpa. And as I mentioned, Donald Trump has this in his chart as well as I do. Also, Paul McCartney, the Beatle, Kalasarpa Yoga. Also, Harrison Ford, the actor, which again, he had a little bit of fear of snakes in some of those movies that he, Indiana Jones, right? He had a little fear of snakes because Sarpa is connected with serpents or snake energy. And also Margaret Thatcher. There's a story of Margaret Thatcher where a woman walked up to her in a park when she was like 15 years old and asked her to read her palm. And she told Margaret Thatcher at 15 that she was going to become one of the most famous women in the world. And it always stuck with Margaret Thatcher, that psychic impression that she got at the age of 15. So Kalasarpa, sometimes the person will experience fame or success, but they can all experience sudden raisings, sudden downfallings. And, Paul McCartney's had a very tumultuous life, even though most of it's been, of course, on the rise, but he's had, loss of his wife, Linda Eastman and, other factors that he had to go through in his life. And just, of course, the breakup of the Beatles and all that.
Also, we've had a lot of Kalasarpa yoga in this COVID period.
Oh, yeah, that's
right?
True.
So
just Kalasarpa has been running a lot just in the charts of the last few months. That's correct. And, there's a really good book written by Alan Anand, A-N-N-A-N-D, Alan Anand, who did a whole talk at our conference on Kalasarpa Yoga. And Steve recorded all of our conferences for a number of years. You could get that recording through Steve if you're interested in that. But yeah, I would highly recommend
stardialsunrecording.com.
Yeah. So I would recommend getting that from Steve if you're interested in that one in terms of Kalasarpa Yoga.
And that's been running the last few months, we can see, because the planets have all been gathered between the nodes. Is that correct, Dennis?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so another question is, does Chiron exist in Vedic astrology?
No, but I utilize it. I found our house in Sedona 26 years ago when Chiron was transiting my ascendant. Again, the exact degree and minute that I was talking about with Saturn, 3 degrees and 10 minutes tropical of Virgo, when we found our house, and we've been in our house for 26 years. So I'm very fond of Chiron, but I think it's strange that, Vedic astrologers don't use some of the asteroids. I always say, isn't it chironic? No. Okay. Anyway, moving on. No.
Right. We saw Uranus and Neptune and I think Pluto on your chart. So some Vedic astrologers stop at Saturn, right? I mean, some traditional Western astrologers do too as well, but you've incorporated those.
Yeah, very good point. I consider myself kind of a neo-Vedic astrologer, in that I do use the outer planets, and we've given a lot of flack around it, to be honest with you, by the traditional Vedic astrologers. A lot of them consider the outer planets to be kind of space trash, is what I've heard sometimes. So, you get people that become really rigid in whatever system they study, and this is where I've always had a problem with Vedic astrology. Sometimes I think it can get just way too rigid, and it doesn't have to be. But sometimes, too, you have to be a little careful of mixing the two systems because, as my teacher Chakrapani said, you have to be careful because you can create goulash, by mixing the two systems up too much. So I never use the rulers in Vedic astrology of with Uranus being connected with Aquarius and things like that. I don't use them. I use the traditional rulers as they would in Hellenistic astrology or medieval astrology.
Okay, Greg is asking about where to find that Alan Anand talk on Kalasarpa Yoga, and Wendy says it's great. So Steve, maybe I can just ask you to type the Sun Recordings link into the chat.
Okay, I'll do that.
Janice asks, when you indicated that Mercury in Pisces in an angle gave Nichabanga, Sorry if I'm
Mhm.
saying that poorly. Did you
That's
mean that any Nietzsche planet in any angle gets Nietzsche Bonga?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. It'll help it. It'll help it greatly to give it more strength. And also, if the dispositor of the Nietzsche planet is strong in the chart, that will also help in terms of strengthening that Nietzsche planet. You know, like for example, let's just say Mercury in Pisces, if Jupiter, the traditional ruler of Pisces, is strong, that will help that Nietzsche planet.
And so the Western translation would be if a planet is debilitated, its strength for its dispositor, or if it has accidental dignity, strength in a house is helpful to it.
Correct. Or if it's, yeah, if it's in an angular house, 1, 4, 7, 10.
And
I
then
think even 5 and 9, I think even 5 and 9, it's helps because those are considered tricona houses or auspicious positive houses.
is that kind of ranking of the power of houses the same in Western and or traditional Western and Vedic, where you go 1, 10, 7, 4, 9, or 11, 5, 9, 3?
It would go a little bit more, the pecking order that I would say in Vedic astrology is a little bit more of 1, 9, 5, and then 10, 7, 4, and then 2, 11, and then 3, 3, 6, 12, and 8.
So
Eight's
it
considered
leans
the most
first
difficult.
geometrically towards the trines and then speaks to the angles. Is that the general
Correct.
transition?
Correct. The trines are considered a little
Why
bit
two, Dennis? Why is two like 2 and 11?
kind of more neutral.
Yeah.
Are they? I mean, they fall a little bit more in the middle.
Yeah, because two
Well,
is like low on the list in the Western rap, right?
yeah, there's some. There's some. 11 is ability to to manifest one's desires and goals. So 11 would fall next. 2 is really questionable because 2 is also considered a maraka or a death inflicting um, uh, house. So it's I think in Hellenistic it's called the gates of Hades, if I remember correctly. So it has a little bit more of a challenge with it. But generally, the 3, 6, 8, and 12 are called Dushtana houses. Third being a mild Dushtana house, a house of difficulty. Dush actually means like evil or bad place. It translates as bad place. So it's generally good to have the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses empty in the Vedic system. But again, I believe that all houses, I've written an article on my website, dennisharness.com, called The 12th House, Misery or Moksha, because I have 4 planets in the 12th house. So I belong to what I call the 12th house club, So anyway, but I don't know if that answers your question. The second is a little more iffy in terms of the pecking order.
Are there terms for like what we call cadent and succedent and angular?
Yeah, there's one, I think it's apoklima. Yeah, there's a couple other terms I like right off the top of my head. I cannot think of them, but the main ones are tricona, kendra, and then upachaya. Those are the main terms that are used. But yeah, there are some other terms used as well, Brent.
Great. I have 7,000 questions I'm going to reserve for another time. There is one more question left in the chat. It's a little bit more towards personal, asking about my chart, which we try not to lean into. So I'm going to create a general question out of it that I think is really alive, especially that we are in eclipse season now. I guess how does the Vedic astrology work with eclipses in general? And then how long are the effects of eclipse said to be around for? Do they come in before the eclipse moment? How long after the eclipse do they last?
I mean, some people even talk about 6-month periods and things like that. I find personally, I look at the eclipse energies coming in strongly for me, in my experience, like a week before, week after. But, we just had this solar eclipse, on Father's Day, and in Vedic astrology, it's in the sign of Gemini. And so wherever Gemini is in your chart, your Vedic chart, you would look and see that particular house area may be a little bit more challenged. The solar eclipses are generally considered more malefic or more challenging in the Vedic system. They are good times to be more inward, to be meditative, to be more on the inner plane levels rather than going out and watching the eclipse. They would say it's better to be more, be more in prayer, be more in meditation during the eclipse energies, even the lunar eclipses as well, although they're not as considered as challenging as the solar eclipse.
And this particular solar eclipse passed right over India, right? So there were probably a lot of people hiding inside.
Yeah, imagine hiding in their closets, Yeah. It was a tricky one, boy, I'll tell you, being right around the summer solstice too, and Father's Day. I had a weird Father's Day. I won't go into any details, but it's very strange, a very strange experience. And in my 11th house, I was telling Kathy, 11th house is profits and gains. It's called Labia, or profits and gains. And I was listening. I think it was Camilla Sutton who was talking about for Leo rising in Vedic, you having that solar eclipse in your 11th house, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And the trip that I've been on, California, our timeshare got canceled because of COVID. So it cost me about $1,500 more than I thought. But I got the big honorarium from NCGR that covers it, right? Right, Steve?
Yeah, really.
All right, thank you, Dan.
All right, you're welcome. So moving on to the nakshatras. I wrote a book on the nakshatras, which is a kind of a really basic book, written really more for beginners. It was written for my students. So those of you that kind of want to explore the nakshatras, I think it's a good cookbook to start with. And then there's a lot of other books out there on the nakshatras that are, Camilla Sutton, for example, wrote a book on the nakshatras as well. So anyway, the nakshatras are the lunar mansions of Vedic astrology that's dividing the zodiac into 27 segments of 13-degree and 20-minute segments. And nakshatra means that which does not decay. It's like a deeper primordial level to the zodiac. It's also, nakshatra means to guard or to protect. Within each of these 27 nakshatras, there are deities that reside in each one of them so that you can actually connect up with the deities associated with your moon nakshatra. For example, the nakshatra Ardra, which falls 6 degrees of 40 minutes of Gemini to 20 degrees of Gemini, is considered one of the most challenging placements for the moon to be. This would be sidereally speaking, Ardra. And because it translates as the star of sorrow or teardrop. So sometimes moon and Ardra, people will have more emotional issues because Ardra is ruled by Rahu. So it gives a lot of ups and downs. I have a close friend of our family's who has moon in Ardra, and he's struggled with bipolar issues since he was a teenager. So not everyone with moon in Ardra is going to have these severe kind of emotional or psychological issues. But all things being equal, it tends to be one of the more challenging nakshatras, Ardra. It's connected with the deity Rudra, who's the ancient form of Shiva. And someone that had their moon and rising sign in Ardra was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the work on death and dying. So it's interesting that she would have both her moon and rising sign in the star of sorrow, and that she, devoted her life to death and dying work. I think also Mother Teresa had something in Ardra. I can't remember what it was too. So again, with each of these aspects in the book, what I try to point out is the positive aspects of each of the nakshatras as well as the challenge side of each of the nakshatras. But Ardra tends to be, it's called a tikshna or sharp nakshatra. The other nakshatra that's, the star of sorrow. This is actually in the, in the funeral, in the cemetery, I'll get it right, in San Bruno, California. I love this, of the fallen angel. I always think of this as kind of representing Ardra. The other nakshatra that's kind of difficult actually is Aslesha. Aslesha is a nakshatra that falls 1640 of Cancer to 30 degrees Cancer sidereally. I have my moon in this one too, so I consider myself in divine recovery with dealing with Kala Sarpa and with Aslesha moon. But as the siren goes off in the background, whenever I invoke Aslacia, something always happens, you know. So, but Aslacia, again, falls totally within the sign of Cancer, so it's ruled by the moon. But Aslacia nakshatra is ruled by Mercury. So it's a very mental nakshatra because you've got the moon and the Mercury as being the two planetary energies associated with it. And then it's also connected with the Nagas, the serpents energy. So I've got a lot of serpent energy around me with having Aslacia moon and then Kalasarpa yoga. And it's interesting because I've had a number of experiences because I live in Arizona of dead snakes on the road, you know, rattlesnakes or bull snakes, you know, hit by cars and things like that. And it's always my custom to get a shovel and shovel them off the street and bury them in our backyard. So one day I picked up this smaller rattlesnake and was getting ready to bury it and was carrying it over to bury it. And I set the snake down on the ground and then I dug the hole. And right when I finished the hole, the snake slithered into the hole. I had been carrying a live rattlesnake in my shovel. Oh my God. Talk about a Kalasarpa experience and Aslacia experience.
Yeah, that's definitely
Again,
worth
if you
the
have
laugh.
you have Aslacia moon, don't give up hope yet. Actually, that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was to kind of try to set the record straight. You know who had Aslacia moon was Mark Edmund Jones, also, who popularized the Sabian symbols. And actually, also Mahatma Gandhi had Aslacia moon, but he had, of course, a very, very intense, very difficult life. Aslacia moon people tend to, all things being equal, tend to have more of an intense kind of life because it's also considered a tikshna or sharp nakshatra. Each of these nakshatras too is connected with an animal. Like for Aslacia, it's connected with a male cat, but I also connect it with the serpent energy, where Ardra was a female dog. So each of these nakshatras has an animal symbol along with the deity. And then Jeshta is another nakshatra that's challenged, and it's called the warrior star. And it falls the last 13 degrees and 20 minutes of Scorpio. So this again would be sidereally speaking. So, you know, again, in Western astrology, it would be, moon would be in the sign of Sagittarius, in middle of Sagittarius. So the Jeshta is ruled by Mercury again. So again, it can be very mental issues, things like that. We have Einstein had his moon, as we mentioned, in Jeshta. Also, the dashas, these cycles, are based on the position of the moon, as I mentioned, in birth. So, for example, Einstein's moon in Jeshta is ruled by Mercury. So that indicates he was in Mercury's dasha. He started his life in the dasha of Mercury, which, remember, his Mercury was in Pisces, Nichabanga in his chart, but still, Mercury in Pisces, the first 12 years of his life, he was under that Mercury influence. So the dashas are like planetary periods or cycles, developmental life cycles. And the dashas reflect how the kind of the maturation of the karmas, how the karmas mature or ripen on the vine, so to speak. And there are, the Vimshotri dasha system actually translates as 120 years. It would take 120 years to fulfill all of the 9 planetary periods, which include Rahu and Ketu. The sequence of them are set the same as they are in the Fredari system that Brett was talking about earlier, based on sect, based on day or night birth, where the dasha system is more sophisticated in the fact that it's looking at the exact degree and minute of the moon at birth. So again, it's a very lunar-based predictive system. Like I said, if you can get nothing else from the Vedic system as a tropical astrologer, I would say to study Vedic astrology and learn the dasha system, because it will give you a lot of depth that you may not see just using Western astrology techniques. Now, this next part of the session, I want to talk about prediction, because I think one of the problems we run into as astrologers, particularly Vedic astrologers, is the whole predictive aspects of astrology, particularly Vedic astrology. And one of my teachers taught me to really look at the ethics around what he called the 3 Ds, death, divorce, and disease, and just the ethical issues around predicting death, divorce, and disease. So first, death. I have clients that will ask me, when am I going to die? And I just don't like to go there. I just really pretty much refuse to go there because I don't want to play God or goddess in that person's life in terms of predicting death. But I'm reminded of the story Michael Luton said once, because there was a friend of mine, Richard Houck, who wrote a book called The Astrology of Death. It's a popular book back in the 90s. And Michael, I was at one of his lectures, and Michael said, you know, one of your friends, Richard Houck, just sent me a copy of this book and wants me to write an endorsement of it. And Michael, who's a great comedian, if those of you that don't know him, a comedic astrologer, he said, I didn't even have to read the book. I already told him what I was going to say before even reading the book. My endorsement would be, this book scared the hell out of me. So anyway, it was really strange, but Richard Houck was asked on a radio program, well, when are you going to die? And he said, oh, I'm going to die when I'm 78 or something like that. Gave some age based on, he used a lot of Vedic techniques and secondary progressions and tertiary predictions and different things. He used Western and tropical and sidereal techniques. But what happened at the age of 56, he died of cancer. And so I'm always think when you start messing with that world of predicting death, you're really evoking the gods and the goddesses. And sometimes the gods and goddesses don't like us to usurp their work. So I think it's always important to bear that in mind. And again, it's one of those areas that I will tend to move away from. You know, sometimes people will even ask you to predict when their parents are going to die so they'll know when they can get their inheritances and things like that. So it gets it's a slippery slope, put it that way. Now, the second one is divorce, which again, I think we have to be careful with this. I know in Vedic astrology, there's actually a technique using the nakshatras, which is based on comparing the moon nakshatras for relationship compatibility. And there's actually a point system where you can get anywhere from 3 or 4 points up to 35 points for compatibility of comparing the moons and the moon nakshatras, moon signs, and all that. So I remember this one couple came to me for a session, and they had, like 5 points out of 35 points of compatibility. And yet they'd already set their wedding date and all that. They were already committed to going through with the marriage. And sure enough, about 6 months into the marriage, they ended up separating and got a divorce. So I thought, man, this system really works. And so sure enough, about 3 or 4 months later, I get a couple that had the same exact moon nakshatras, and they had the 5 points of compatibility. And yet they had stayed together for 20 years, but they had 3 children, and I said, well, God, how did you do this? And they said, well, we've gone through about 3 or 4 marital therapists, but they, hung in there. And so who am I to say whether or not they should have gotten divorced or stayed together? So again, divorce is kind of one of those areas that I think we always have to be careful with prediction. This is a picture actually of my ex-wife and I. It was one of her favorite pictures of us. About the shadow of the relationship. It really was one of her favorite pictures of us, which kind of made a statement about the marriage. It was one of those 3 rings of marriage that we were talking about earlier, for sure. Here we have Radha and Krishna, one of the more happy married couples, although they weren't even married. So maybe that's why it worked out so well. Divine romance, divine romance. Now, I wanted everyone to look at this and try to figure out which of the vignettes you would find true love. Would it be in the first vignette, the second one, or the third one? Anybody have any ideas out there? Any predictions on where you'd find true love? Well, I finally, after looking at this one night as a Zen koan, I finally decided that it would be in the third vignette, where the guy's looking into a shoe because that's where you would find your soulmate. All right, get some laughter.
All right, very good.
All right, here we go. Moving on. The third is disease. And this is in terms of, again, predicting disease. I think we have to be, again, kind of cautious around these issues, because the problem with astrology is that, especially predictive astrology, is it can invoke fear for clients and also be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. So I think we have to be careful around predicting disease. I don't know if you can read this cartoon, but the doctor is examining the patient. He says, "No two ways about it, Mr. LeBlanc. You've acquired a moon. Would you like me to try to remove it?" And the patient says, "I don't know. It distracts me while I'm driving, but my wife finds it very romantic." So I always think of this as kind of the person, as when these dashas, they're running these dashas, it's literally like the planet is rotating around your head. It's almost like you need to befriend the god or the goddess. Actually, that's what Carl Jung said it very well. He said, "The gods and goddesses no longer live on Olympus. They live in our minds as complexes and our bodies as disease." So he said the goal of archetypal therapy was to befriend the goddess or befriend the god. So I think in a way, when we're running these dashas, it's good to connect up with the energy of them. So for example, if you're running Saturn's dasha, which is a 19-year cycle, it may be good to read Robert Svoboda's book called The Greatness of Saturn. Or if you're running Mercury's dasha, which is 17-year cycle, there's a really good book written by a Jungian analyst named Murray Stein called In Midlife. And if you have a dark moon, you're born under the Psalmaker dark moon, new moon, really good book to read, I think, is Demetra George's book, Mysteries of the Dark Goddess, or the Dark Moon. Is it Mysteries of the Dark Moon? I think it's Mysteries of the Dark Moon by Demetra George. Again, we talked about Einstein's chart earlier with that moon in Scorpio. Now, there's a story that Yogananda and his guru, Sri Yukteswar, who's pictured to the right, his guru was a great Vedic astrologer, where Yogananda was told by his guru in this chapter, Outwitting the Stars, that he was going to get severely ill at a certain time. And sure enough, his guru said, "You know, the illness is going to come in about a month from now. So what I want you to do is to be doing these meditative practices, wearing certain astrological bangle, which is certain metals and gems, and again, be doing a very strict sadhana." So sure enough, a month, but Yogananda, again, he kind of refuted his guru and said, "But sir, I don't believe in astrology." And that's when his guru said, "A wise man does not discard his maps until he gets to his destination." So sure enough, about a month later, Yogananda became very ill. And the illness lasted for a couple of weeks. It was due to a liver problem that he had. And you can actually see it in his chart, because Yogananda had Jupiter-Mars conjunction in the 8th house, which is the house of death. Jupiter rules liver. Mars sometimes is considered a, quote, a challenge planet, a malefic planet. And they were both aspected by Saturn, by the opposition of Saturn. So it was during his Mars-Jupiter period, Mars was the major cycle, Jupiter was the minor cycle, that this health crisis came to fruition. And sure enough, after a week or two of this illness, he was able to come out of it. And his guru said, if you wouldn't have been practicing these techniques and these remedial measures, you could have died. So that was when Yogananda came out with the title Outwitting the Stars. He thought that that was really cool, that you could outwit the karma, so to speak, of the planets. But again, the karma came, but again, of course, Yogananda was an avatar, so it's not quite fair for most of us. But again, he was able to circumvent the difficult karma that was to come. They say in India, one of the lines in the Rig Veda is that the use of astrology is to avert the danger that is yet to come, which sounds like a really heavy statement. But in India, if you get a session with an Indian astrologer, quite often they will point out what they call the doshas, or the impurities in the chart, because they feel it's their job to warn you about what's coming so that you can circumvent the challenging karmas. So they're not so much into telling you all the good things and all the wonderful things. Now, for me, from my vantage point, I think we need to build on the strengths of the chart and of the client. But we also don't want to, as I was mentioning to Kathy, we don't want to cheerlead a person off the cliff either, by saying everything's love and light, it's all great, it's all good, and then, they run into, Rahu transit or something, that upends their life. So again, it's finding that balance and how to counsel someone. Now, this next part, I'm going to talk about challenging client styles, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers again. One of the challenging client styles I find as an astrologer, which is usually quite often one of the most longest hours of my life, is what I call the skeptic or the confounder. And this is usually a person that's come to you as a birthday gift, the proverbial, somebody gifted them a session and they have no interest whatsoever in astrology except to be the skeptic and to make you wrong. So like I said, these are usually one of the longest hours of my life to do these sessions. There's also what I call the professional client. These are the clients quite often I see in Sedona, where the client has been to everyone imaginable, for psychic readings, in Sedona, I mean, it's like every other person is a psychic or mystic. I mean, even my manicurist reads palms, it's like, and my automobile attendant is a karma mechanic, so anyway, but, you get these clients that'll come in, and then one client came in the other day and she asked me, how much is it for a complete metaphysical? So anyway, I had a client the other day walk into my office too with his duck on his head. And I said, can I help you? And the duck said, yeah, can you get this guy off my ass? Anyway, all right, I'll move on. There's also the client that I call rescue me, where they want you to, they've come and they've really going through a really difficult patch and they want you to provide some kind of remedy, to save them from their karma. And it reminds me of the story of this one friend of mine who had just graduated, got his PhD in psychology, but he couldn't find any work. And he was looking for a job and he saw that an ad in the paper, it said wanted zoo attendant. So he went down to the zoo to apply for this job, and the owner of the zoo said, it's not a zoo attendant what we need. What it is our gorilla died, and it's going to take us several months to get a new gorilla from Africa to come over. So what we would like for you to do is to dress up in this gorilla suit and pretend that you're a gorilla, because what good is a zoo without a gorilla? And so the guy's thinking to himself, he's going, God, I'm out of work. I could use the work. So he decides to go ahead and he says, I'll take the job. So he gets into the gorilla suit and, he's going, this is really pretty fun. This is going to be great. So he goes out and he starts, the kids start clapping, the gorilla's out. He's thinking to himself, he says, maybe if I do a really good job, they'll decide to hire me full time. So he sees a big tire with a rope on the end of it. A big rope, with the tire on the end of it. And he goes and he jumps on this tire and he starts swinging higher and higher and higher until the rope snaps. And he goes flying off and he lands right into the lion's den. And he starts to scream, somebody help me, help, somebody help me. And the lion lunges at him and he says, you better shut up or you're going to get us both fired. All right, it's only in the San Francisco Zoo that would happen. Let me see here. So that's the rescue me story. Now the victim is the one that's really hard to work with. This is a person that comes in and just everything is just totally victimized by life in general. And one of the things that I try to do just with all my clients is to try to help them to take an active role in their healing process rather than just being passive recipient of a cure. That's the problem. One of the problems with Vedic astrology was we do recommend these remedial measures. And sometimes I mentioned the use of gemstones can be used, but it's not like that's going to just change their karma dramatically just by wearing this gemstone. It's just one remedial measure of many that can be utilized. But again, the main idea is to help the client to take an active role in the healing process, I think is the main thing that that I would say. That actually is from the same, that statue is from the same one in the San Bruno Cemetery, as well as the fallen angel. So I always think of this as the sun in Leo in the 12th house. Now, really challenging client style is the paranoid schizophrenic, Now, in Sedona, we actually even have a group there called Paranoids Anonymous. But the problem is they never let you know where the meeting is at. All right, moving on. Borderline personality disorder is probably the most difficult client to work with. We could make a case for narcissistic borderline personality disorders being the diagnosis for our friend Donald Trump. Borderline personality disorder people, they quite often think in black and white thinking. Sometimes what'll happen as an astrologer, they'll come and get a session with you and they'll just say how imperfect you were, how amazing you were, how you literally, were the best astrologer that they've ever gone to. And then they'll come back to see you a month or two later, and then they'll decide that you're the worst astrologer they've ever been to. So it's kind of like what Carl Jung said. He said, if somebody makes you God, the devil's not far behind. Or as I like to say, one day you're God and the next day you're Godzilla. So these clients can actually be some of the most difficult. I've had several in my 30 years of practice, and they have been like literally a nightmare on Elm Street to work with. So if you're aware of that, if you just read up on narcissistic personality disorder and look for some of these common qualities, it can kind of save you a lot of heartache by taking these clients on. One of the most important things to have, at least this was popular when I was a kid, of course now it's different, was a Rolodex on your desk to be able to know how to refer people to psychologists that may specialize in working with narcissistic personality disorder. And again, psychologists, if you talk to them, they'll say it's one of the most difficult clients to work with because they do not feel anything's wrong with them. So they're very defended about any kind of criticism or critique of their nature. And then multiple personality disorder. These are my favorite clients to work with because they like to pay 3 times. Okay. Now, I think we'll open it up now to see, before I go into this last phase, talking about transpersonal counseling a little bit more in depth. Any questions? Anything's come in, Brett?
Yeah, Georgia Stathis recommends the book Walking on Eggshells to investigate borderline disorder personalities. She says it's
thank you, Georgia. And Georgia and I got to teach together at Kepler too. We had a lot of fun teaching on, I think we taught on signs and rashis, as they call them in India, and some other, and I think on mythology as well, archetypal astrology.
Greg asks if you can see borderline personality disorder in a chart.
It's a good question. Usually, I mean, not always, but it can be, there can be, in terms of the narcissistic part, a lot of Leo energy in the chart. If we look at Donald Trump's chart, for example, I'll pull it up in a minute again. I just don't want to show it too much or we'll get depressed. But anyway, he's got Leo rising in his chart with Mars and Leo. And so sometimes you'll see that strong Leo energy that'll be there in the chart in terms of the narcissism. So that would be one factor that I would say.
Is the kind of archetypal transmission around Leo in that regard similar in the Vedic tradition as it is in the Western tradition, Dennis?
Yeah.
And just a more global question would be, is there a similarity between what the Vedic tradition teaches about the psychological energies of the archetypes and that which we learn in the West?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Of course, I was trained originally in tropical astrology, so I see there's a crossover. One of the things that I find is that when you see someone that has the sun sign, for example, in Leo in both their tropical and their sidereal chart, they'll really embody that energy, very strongly. By for example, though, I'm Virgo in Western astrology, but I go into Leo in the Vedic system. And I always say that's the real reason why I got into studying Vedic astrology is I get to be a Leo. So, anyway, but it does create a paradox, though. This is one of the thorny issues that we have to look at in using both systems is how could it be so that someone could be Sun in Virgo and yet, Sun in Leo sidereally. So it is this, and I actually, to be honest with you, I can relate to both of my charts, just like I can relate to my Chinese astrology chart, as well. So maybe, to be able to hold these different systems simultaneously, you get a more fuller picture of someone and can be of more help and benefit to them as an astrologer by knowing different systems.
And in about 450 years, there won't be the opportunity for somebody to be Leo in both for another 24,000 years or whatever.
It's a good point. It's a good point. It's a little bit depressing because in Vedic astrology, we've got about 400 and some years until we get to the age of Aquarius. So we're still in the age of Pisces in sidereal astrology.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a different question, something I'm always after, but do you see that precession of the 0 Aries tropical point, the east point, to the cusp of sidereal Aquarius as a demarcator for the dawning of the age of Aquarius? Like, do you see it as a meshing of the 12 tropical signs and the 12 sidereal signs?
I'd have to think about that. It's a good question. Let me ponder that one for a while.
Because, it's usually taught to be a constellational trip, but obviously the sidereal signs and the constellations are a very different thing.
I know we use as the fiducial star for calculating 0 degrees Aries in the Vedic chart as Spica. Spica is based, connected with Lahiri and Amsha, and Spica would be Vedically would be 0 degrees of Libra.
Which is an interesting thing, right? Because this is the alpha star of the constellation they call Virgo, which defines 0 degrees Libra in the sidereal zodiac. And it's usually thought that sidereal equals constellational, but that cannot be so for any equal division of the ecliptic into signs because the constellations vary significantly in size.
Correct.
Which anyway, so for people to find out their sidereal zodiac, we get a question from MS or EMS, I'm not sure. Are there any free websites you recommend for doing Vedic charts and analysis, like there are so many for the Western tradition?
If people contact me, if some people contact me, I'll be glad to do their chart just for a minimal amount, like $5 to cover my handling of just to send them a copy of the chart. So I'll do that for them. You could check into, I don't know, Sri Jyoti Star, does he have something on there where they run the chart? I don't think so.
No, I don't.
There's a bunch of them online if you search. It's just what I'm hearing is Dennis isn't
Yeah, I think if you search.
going to direct
Just
anyone.
Google
So,
it.
Dennis,
Yeah.
if they want to contact you for a chart, what's the best way to do that?
I would just say to email me, dennis@dennisharness.com. Just
Awesome.
email me, dennis@dennisharness.com. My website is just dennisharness.com. And, you can also, of course, schedule a regular consultation too there. So if you ask me, just email me and I'll give a NCGR discount to people that actually want to get their read with me. Just remind me that you're an NCGR member and I'll give you a discount on session.
Awesome. Claudia asks, what are the positives of Ardra?
Positive of Ardra, I think, is they have a capacity to help people to release emotion because it's connected with alleviating pain and suffering. So they have like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross would be a good example for that. And I found with Ardra people, they tend to be good for astrology. It's probably because Ardra falls into the sign of Gemini ruled by Mercury. So they're very mercurial people, so that's another aspect to Ardra. But I find that they're quite often, charts of astrologers as well as psychologists are somewhat challenged because we're taking on a lot of challenging karma of our clients. So this is maybe a way that we work through some of our karmas by helping other people with their, going through their deep challenges in life. But Ardra also is connected with Rudra, who is Shiva, the ancient form of Shiva, who is the yogi that's connected with yoga, with Hatha Yoga. And Ardra, also Rudra, Shiva, is connected with wild animals. So sometimes they can have some interest in wanting animal rights and protecting animals. And the other symbol for Ardra is an electrical storm or a storm. And you know how after a storm, how much clarity there is, in the world, but after a big storm, in terms of just the sky is, full of clarity. And there's that, because actually Ardra means the moist or the wet one, moist. So it's connected again with tears, and how when we are able to cry, sometimes we have these deep catharsis, these deep emotional experiences of clarity. I remember seeing a PowerPoint presentation by a woman, a yoga teacher that worked a lot with people with depression. And one of her teachers from India said that crying is the greatest form of yoga. So that may be some of the things that I would say just off the top of my head with Ardra. It's also connected with the dog energy, with the female dog. So there may be some instinctual energy and how, dogs can be very loyal as well.
Georgia asks, would dashas that begin in one's life with more challenged planets like Saturn or Mars experience a different path, more difficult, as opposed to people who begin their lives with perhaps a Mercury or Venus dasha? And maybe, Dennis, could you also just say one quick thing about what are the conditions to begin your life in a Mars dasha versus a Venus dasha?
Yeah, you would have to start a Mars dasha, you would have to fall into the moon, would have to fall into one of the nakshatras like Mrigashira, which I think you and Steve share, Brad, would indicate that you were born into a Mars dasha. Now, granted, and there's two other nakshatras ruled by Mars as well. Chitra is ruled by Mars, and Dhanishta, which falls into Capricorn Aquarius, is ruled by Mars. But the Mars dasha, all things being equal, is a difficult dasha to be born under. But if Mars is well placed in the chart, then it may be fine, But I always think of those first few years of life are very important, And for Mars, it could be, wanting to be a spiritual warrior, learning about being a spiritual warrior, which is the strong aspect of Mars. But all things being equal, generally the Venus dasha or Jupiter dashas are a little more user-friendly to be born under if the Venus and Jupiter are well aspected in the chart and well placed. But the problem with that is that you sometimes will use up one of your favorable dashas and you're not old enough to really be able to, to really work with it. So sometimes I feel like people born in Mars, for example, they go through Mars and then they go into Rahu, within the first few years of life. But if they survive Mars and Rahu, then they got those dashas out of their way. So then they go into Jupiter, usually around the age of 20 or something like that. So again, there's always a plus and a minus. I guess at the end of the day, it's from what point of view do you want to look at the game from?
So it's a topic for another one of your many talks, but basically your periods, your dashas begin with the planet who rules the nakshatra where the moon is found, and also where you're born within the length of that dasha is determined by where the moon is within that nakshatra, so that if you're at the end of the nakshatra, you have less of a period of that dasha than you would before you change dashas. But from there, the sequence of dashas and the length of the dashas is the same, right?
That's eloquently said. That's perfect. Yeah, I'm actually doing a lecture on this down for the Orange County group in September. For those and I think it's going to be Zoom as well because, with COVID and everything, I doubt if I'll do it in person in September. So, but the talk is going to be on that. But you said it perfectly, perfectly well. It's position, the natal position of the moon, which nakshatra it's in, and then what planet rules that nakshatra, and then proportional in terms of the number of years of that dasha, how far the moon has moved through that nakshatra exactly.
Yeah, I really find a beautiful eloquence to that, because like in the Western, the closest thing that I've found to analogs in the Western tradition would be Fradaria, or which is the same for everybody born at day or born at night, or the thesis, which modern traditional astrologers have come to call zodiacal releasing. And that's the same thing. In one level, it doesn't matter where the lot of fortune or the lot of spirit is in a sign. It's just about what sign it's in. So there's a really beautiful, I think, energy of kind of where in the nakshatra the moon is found that determines your planetary periodicity or the dasha system. So, and that also dovetails to this next question at the end of a nice comment from Greg, which is, Dennis, you have been so informative and insightful, notwithstanding my complete lack of Vedic astrological experience. I thought I might not be able to follow much of what you would talk about, but this offering has been one of the most accessible and informative in which I have participated. Do you have other recordings, teachings, or lectures available online, and do you regularly give talks?
Yeah, as I was mentioning, I'll be doing that talk down for the Orange County group in September, but I also organized the conference which Steve and Mary come and Kathy speak at in Sedona, and that'll be coming up in November. The website is just sedonavedicastrology.com, and we actually have an all-day workshop on introduction to Vedic astrology. And I was just talking to Steve and Mary about this, that most likely due to COVID, we'll probably have to do at least some of it, if not all of it, through Zoom. So, but you can still go and check out the schedule under sedonavedicastrology.com. And we have over 30 faculty that speak. And like I said, we'll hopefully, at minimum, we'll do a lot of it at Zoom, but we may end up having to reschedule the main conference, main part of it for 2021. But I'm a Moon Jupiter person in Cancer, so I'm still an optimist, but my optimism is running a little thin these days with Arizona peaking as well as California again. But yeah, and I helped to organize which Kathy's on the board of, is the American College of Vedic Astrology. I organized helped to put together their whole online program. And what is that? acvaonline.org, I think it is, ACVA. I think it's acvaonline.org. You can check out, that's an online program for those that want to study Vedic astrology and become certified in it. And there's just a lot of great teachers out there. I do take on some students privately for tutoring, so you could always contact me about that as well. So those would be some of the things that just come to mind.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the compliment. I appreciate that. Appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, well, there's a good amount of those in the chat and just a lot of thank you, Dennis's. There's one more, which is kind of a very specific question. I'm born September 17th. Am I still a Virgo in Vedic? So just folks, to make that more of a general thing, first of all, Andrea, the answer is yes. You're at the first degree of sidereal Virgo, at least in the Lahiri zodiac. For generally, you can basically subtract 24 degrees from your tropical placements to get to the sidereal placements. But in 1959, it was more like 23 and change. So get a chart cast for yourself, and understand that there's also different sidereal zodiacs. So it's not just tropical versus sidereal. It gets even more beautiful and confusing than that.
Yeah, I always call it getting an astrological makeover, getting your chart done, So, okay, I'm going to move to the home stretch here, these last 10 minutes or so that we have, since we started a few minutes after 2. We'll just go until about 5 after 4, if that's okay. This is I mentioned our conference. This is the conference, the Adult Children of Normal Parents Annual Convention. And this will be probably about how well attended our conference will be done. We'll have in Sedona if we have it due to social distancing. Okay, moving on here. I like what Chakraparty, one of my main gurus from India, said. He said, our spiritual life does not even begin until we face our shadow. he wasn't a psychologist by training, but he said, it's just so much to face the shadow side of things. This is actually a picture of the fortune teller. And the fortune teller is here, and he's getting his pocket picked while he's getting his fortune read. And so I think sometimes fortune telling, we have to be, again, there's a whole shadow with it. It's actually where the term charlatan comes from, or the ancient Chaldeans, some of the first astrologers in recorded history. Jung again said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And Nietzsche said, man's shadow, I thought, is his vanity. So I think it's very important as an astrologer to stay humble. I think it's very important to stay really humble and to realize that we don't know, because there's a whole book written, I can't remember, it's by, you would remember that, Craig someone, but anyway, it's called the Psychotherapist Shadow. And in my chapter, there's an article on my website called Vedic Astrology and Transpersonal Counseling, which is the name of this talk. And in there's a section called The Astrologer's Shadow, which those of you may want to take a look at to read up on. It's just a free article on my website on dennisharness.com. I think we're tired of Donald Trump, so we'll wind on down from Donald. And just to end with some of what I consider the keys to developing good, what I call chart side manner. And the first is to stay humble and compassionate. And then in India, being really present, listening and observing omens. That's why I think it's good. In India, the traditional practice of astrology was in the jungle, so that you could actually look for omens, like birds. Different birds would represent omens. It's interesting, Kathy's place here, there's so many birds around, in terms of omens and things like that, with her office having a beautiful glass window looking outside towards her garden. And I think it's nice, if possible, and I have this in my office too, is to have a window to where you can see out to nature is ideal. But again, these omens can be a lot of things. It can even be your feeling, your temperament during the time of the session, how you're feeling as an astrologer. There's even a way that some astrologers in India would focus on the breath, whether the breath was coming in through the right or left nostril was saying something about the session as well. So there's the whole use of omens. You can actually even run a chart called the Prashna chart, which is like a horary chart for the moment, to see what's going on in terms of astrologically at that moment in time. Also, as we mentioned, helping to make the unconscious conscious, as we mentioned earlier, and assisting the client to explore some of the potential lessons with these dashas or these planetary cycles, which is a huge thing, and to kind of help the person to befriend that particular planetary energy during that dasha. And I should say, during the dashas, there are sub-cycles within the cycles. So there's a main dasha running, and then there's a sub-cycle running as well. So it's not just like the one dasha is just the whole flavor through the whole, these dashas can be anywhere from 6 years, the sun cycle, up to 20 years, the Venus cycle. So there are different periods of time associated with each dasha, but the sequence is always in the same sequence. Astrology should be, I like what my teacher, Angelis Arian, who taught me the Tarot, she said that good astrology, or good Tarot readings even, good Tarot practitioner or astrologer should be a choice revealer rather than a choice maker. This is my backyard in Sedona. For those of you that have never been to Sedona, it is definitely a very magical, mystical place to go to. So highly recommend, if not in November, hopefully in 2021, you'll be able to come down for a visit.
Is that Snoopy Rock, Dennis?
It's been, I don't know if you can see this. I don't know if you can see the arrow on this, but no, it's not Snoopy, but this, I call it Pharaoh Rock because it has like 2 eyes and then a little nose and whatever. It reminds me of a pharaoh from Egypt. But I call this one Ganesha Rock. You can see the elephant trunk on this one. I don't know.
I'm just trying to place myself. Maybe that ship rock in the background?
No, that way in the background is Thunder Mountain.
Ah, got it. Now I see.
Kind of my backyard area. This is where I live, kind of in this area. Thunder Mountain is called also Old Grayback or Capitol Butte, or also the dragon, the back of the dragon. Supposedly the Snake Clan lived a lot, which is interesting with my Aslation moon and my Kalasarpa Yoga. The Native American Snake Clan lived in this area of Sedona. Now, finally, some of the other chart side manner aspects is to, as I mentioned, to help the client to take an active role in the healing process rather than being a passive recipient of a cure. The chart can reveal what I call the karmic code, which is a book I'm working on, a trilogy I'm working on, which really explores the major archetypal themes that are reflected through the chart. And these, again, sometimes will show up, of course, with tropical or sidereal astrology in terms of planetary archetypes. And then I call good astrology as kind of like MapQuest to the self or MapQuest to God or goddess. But again, as one of my teachers said, you know, astrology can help us to navigate through to the gates of heaven, but it won't get us through the gates. And then besides learning astrological counseling techniques, I think the greatest gift that we can give to our clients is also our state of consciousness that we can have to offer our client. And finally, to leave a client with a sense of faith, strength, optimism, hope, and a vision for a more empowered future. And finally, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So anyway, thank you for being a good audience. It was enjoyable for me. I enjoyed it, had a good time. So I hope you did as well.
Yay.
Kathy, do you want to close us out from next door?
Yeah, just thank you, Dennis. And, you know, I forgot to mention that at the beginning that Dennis and I was president of Kepler College for a while, and Dennis came as our Vedic teacher and then developed the Vedic Astrology track. So we really grew the Vedic Astrology program here in the States. That was one big way. And Georgia, who's on the call, I mean, taught there too. So
great.
we have a big Kepler connection. Anyway, thank you, everybody. And we'll hope to see you on next Friday, on July 3rd, for our salon, and for Dawn Silver in July. And I guess bye for now.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great talk.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you on Zoom in Sedona or in person.
Okay.
This is the end of this session. Voiceovers by Mary Gal Pincus. Audio and video editing by Steve Pincus. For more selections, go to stardialsunrecording.com.